An engine explosion is one of the most catastrophic events that can happen on an aircraft. It is a rare occurrence, but it can have serious consequences for the aircraft and its passengers. The explosion can be caused by a variety of factors, including mechanical failure, fuel contamination, or foreign object damage. The effects of an engine explosion. An engine explosion can have several effects on the aircraft, depending on the severity of the explosion and the altitude and airspeed of the aircraft. One of the most immediate effects is a loss of power and thrust, which can cause the aircraft to lose altitude and airspeed rapidly. In addition to the loss of power, an engine explosion can cause debris to be expelled from the engine, which can damage other parts of the aircraft. The debris can also pose a significant risk to the passengers and crew, as it can strike the aircraft's fuselage or windows. The explosion can also cause a fire in the engine, which can spread to other parts of the aircraft if not extinguished quickly. The fire can produce smoke and toxic fumes, which can impair the crew's vision and breathing and make it difficult to evacuate the aircraft. Finally, an engine explosion can cause a significant vibration in the aircraft, which can make it difficult to control. The vibration can also damage other parts of the aircraft, such as the control surfaces and landing gear. The pilot's response to an engine failure. When an engine fails or explodes, the pilot's response is critical to the safety of the aircraft and its passengers. The pilot will follow a series of procedures to maintain control of the aircraft and bring it to a safe landing. The first step is to identify which engine has failed and take action to compensate for the loss of power. If the aircraft has multiple engines, the pilot will adjust the thrust of the remaining engines to maintain altitude and airspeed. If the aircraft has a single engine, the pilot will need to adjust the aircraft's attitude and airspeed to maintain control. The pilot will also need to communicate with air traffic control to obtain any additional information about the situation and to request clearance to land at the nearest airport. The pilot will need to provide information about the aircraft's position, altitude, and airspeed and describe the nature of the emergency. If the aircraft cannot maintain altitude and airspeed, the pilot will need to initiate an emergency descent to a lower altitude where the remaining engines can generate enough thrust to keep the aircraft in the air. The pilot will communicate with the passengers and flight attendants to prepare them for the emergency landing and instruct them on the proper brace position. If the engine failure is due to a mechanical failure or damage, the pilot may need to use backup systems or instruments to maintain control of the aircraft. For example, if the engine failure has caused a loss of hydraulic pressure, the pilot may need to use manual controls to operate the flaps, landing gear, and other systems. If the aircraft has multiple engines, the pilot may be able to continue flying using the remaining engines. However, if the remaining engines are not powerful enough to keep the aircraft in the air, the pilot may need to consider a forced landing. This is a high-risk procedure that involves landing the aircraft on an unsuitable surface, such as a field or a highway. In the case of a forced landing, the pilot will need to select a suitable landing site and prepare the aircraft and passengers for impact. The pilot will adjust the aircraft's flaps and landing gear to provide the best possible landing configuration. The pilot will also communicate with the passengers and flight attendants to prepare them for the impact and instruct them on the proper brace position. The pilot will also need to ensure that the aircraft is as light as possible by jettisoning any excess fuel and cargo. Once the pilot has selected a landing site, they will need to execute a controlled crash landing. This involves reducing the aircraft's airspeed and flaring the aircraft to reduce the impact force. The pilot will try to land the aircraft on its belly to prevent the landing gear from collapsing and causing additional damage to the aircraft. During the landing, the passengers and crew will need to brace themselves to minimize injuries. The flight attendants will need to secure any loose objects and prepare the cabin for impact. After the aircraft has come to a stop, the crew will evacuate the passengers as quickly as possible. The evacuation may be complicated by factors such as fire, smoke, and debris, but the crew will do everything possible to get the passengers to safety. Investigation and follow-up. After the aircraft has been evacuated, the investigation process begins. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, will conduct a thorough investigation to determine the cause of the engine failure and identify any contributing factors. The investigation will involve examining the aircraft's flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, as well as conducting interviews with the crew and witnesses. The investigators will also examine the engine and any debris to determine the cause of the failure. Once the investigation is complete, the NTSB will issue a report detailing its findings and recommendations. The report may recommend changes to regulations, procedures, or maintenance practices to prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. In addition to the investigation, the airline and its maintenance provider will conduct their own internal investigations to identify any issues with their procedures or maintenance practices. The airline will also provide support to the passengers and crew and offer compensation for any injuries or damages incurred during the incident. Conclusion: an engine explosion is a rare occurrence, but it can have serious consequences for the aircraft and its passengers. The pilot's response to an engine failure is critical to the safety of the aircraft and its passengers. The pilot will follow a series of procedures to maintain control of the aircraft and bring it to a safe landing. The investigation process after an engine failure is essential to identify the cause of the failure and prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. The NTSB will conduct a thorough investigation, and the airline and maintenance provider will conduct their own internal investigations. In the end, it is important to remember that flying remains one of the safest modes of transportation, and the aviation industry has a strong safety record. While an engine failure or explosion is a serious event, it is a rare occurrence, and the industry is constantly working to improve safety and prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future.